Hello everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. Today we are embarking on yet another reading vlog because I have not read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the newest Hunger Games novel, the prequel to the series, and as you all know, the movie has recently come out, and so obviously I need to read the book before I watch the movie. It's already been like a couple weeks since the movie has been out. I've been hearing rave reviews, which has honestly just surprised me so hard because I was expecting it to be bad, to be honest. I don't particularly like it when authors come back and do like a prequel or a really late sequel. I tend to just like the self-contained original series or, you know, books. So when this book came out, I wasn't super motivated to read it. I did buy a copy because I was like, I need to have a first edition no matter what, even if I don't like it. And although I wanted to read it for curiosity's sake, I wasn't actually expecting it to be all that good. And I honestly had heard pretty mixed reviews about it when it first came out. And so now that the movie is out and everyone's like raving about it, I'm just like, I need to read this. I need to know what's going on. I need to be in on the whole thing. I need to not feel this FOMO. So today's Tuesday, it's the middle of the week. I am planning to start this tonight while I do some other things around the apartment, maybe clean up. I have to do some editing today, but I really want to dig into a bit of this today. And then I'll probably also listen to some of the audiobook tomorrow at work. We'll see how quickly I can read this, but I feel like it's going to be pretty quick since, you know, it's YA, it's a familiar world, and I do remember the writing style of the Hunger Games series, and it was pretty straightforward, so this should be a really quick read. I feel like when I think of Hunger Games, I'm really thinking of me when I was 12 years old, reading the books for the first time, and just absolutely being mind blown with them, and also recognizing even at a young age back then, all of the political themes in the books. And, you know, with everything going on right now in the world, you know, please visit the link down below. Please call for ceasefire, permanent ceasefire. I feel like this story, this book, this movie is very on topic, but I also would like to remind us all that dystopia, for the most part, you know, these dystopias that we read just tend to be all of the awful things that are actually happening in real life to people of color, to marginalized folks around the world. All these books are just all of those things happening to white people, and it's seen as horrific and horrifying and awful.
Where the Capitol just bombed a hospital filled with unarmed men, women, and children, and there will be no survivors. If you think for 1 second that the Capitol will ever treat us fairly, you are lying to yourselves, because we know who they are and what they do. This is what they do, and we must fight back.
These are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missile.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
Compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm looking to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
Isn't a place, with all due respect, you know, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. You know, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too.
And the people who are committing those horrible acts are, you know, awful villains. But when we are faced with those villains in real life,
I will burn their city to the ground. I will find every rat hole that they hide in. And I will drop down enough explosives to scare God Almighty. I do not see men. I do not see soldiers. I see lions. I see a pride of hungry lions. Let me tell you a promise, gentlemen. A promise that I give to you before God Almighty. It is hunt season in Gaza. And you will all be well fed before this is done.
For some reason, we are incapable of denouncing them, of calling them out, of not being complicit in their machine.
We are operating militarily according to rules of international law, period. Unequivocally. It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up, they could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we're at war. We are at war. We're at war we are defending our homes. We're protecting our homes. That's the truth. And then when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we'll break their backbone.
These aren't the only things Israel's government has been saying. Probably not even the worst things the Israeli government's been saying. Let's start with lower level politicians, like Parliament member Meirav Ben-Ari, who said, "The children of Gaza brought this upon themselves. So even children aren't innocent if they're Palestinian." That one's pretty bad. I'm gonna rank it at number 2. Another parliament member, Ariel Kalner, he said, "Right now, one goal, Nakba." When Israel was founded in 1948, killed 15,000 Palestinians in over a dozen massacres, and kicked 750,000 people out of their homes. Palestinians call this the Nakba. And apparently so do Israeli politicians when they're advocating genocide. I think that's gonna go in spot number 4. Number 3, Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant, and his now infamous quote calling Palestinians human animals. Classic dehumanization. Seeing Palestinians as less than human justifies their murder. The fact that that's not even in the number 1 spot. Israel's racist national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir said, "No food or water should enter Gaza, just hundreds of tons of explosives." That's going in spot number 6. He said way worse before. This guy's called for entire Palestinian towns to be wiped off the map. It's nothing original. In number 5, Israel's President Isaac Herzog. He implied in a speech that the entire population of Gaza is guilty, and that it's not true that there are innocent people who live there. So now it's okay to starve and kill them. That's going in spot number 5 because it doesn't have that creative racism of the next one. Israel's prime minister himself saying this is a fight between the children of the light and the children of the darkness. That Israel is the side of humanity and 2 million Palestinians in Gaza are not. That's the kind of dehumanization that leads to thousands of people killed. That's the kind of rhetoric that stops people from seeing Palestinians as human. This is why we need a ceasefire now.
And yeah, I would just like us all to think on that. So I'm really excited to read this. I feel like it's gonna fire me up also in a way because all of the atrocities that have been going on in Palestine have just been driving me insane. And I think it's sometimes nice to sort of see these things play out in fiction and feel like there's some sort of resolve. But one thing I do love about Suzanne Collins' books is that she doesn't give us that resolve. Those of you who remember Mockingjay and the end of Mockingjay, we all know how that plays out, and you don't get a full sense of a resolution. You don't get a sense of victory because there is no winning. Anyways, those are my opening thoughts. I am going into this with mid expectations, I think. I don't think it's gonna live up to the original series, but I do think it might be interesting, and I do feel like it's gonna have some cool insights. I'm really curious to see what I think of President Snow, because as we know, for those of you who are new to this whole situation, President Snow is the bad guy in the Hunger Games series, and this prequel is from his perspective, I believe, and we're following him when he was much younger, and the building of the whole system of the Hunger Games and, you know, the capital and the districts and all of that. I have heard many a person who has seen the movie tell me that he is super hot in the movie, which I'm sure he is, and I'm also curious to see how the actor plays President Snow, because I feel like the actor that they got for President Snow, the older version in the original series, was really good. Like, he nailed President Snow, in my opinion, like the way I envisioned him in the books. So I'm really curious to see how this younger actor portrays this younger version of him. And I'm also just curious to see, you know, the making of a villain. But I do want to caution those of you who will read this book and say, oh, he's a tortured villain, like, we should have sympathy for him. No! He is literally the scum of the earth, evil incarnate. Like, no. I think it's interesting to see the insights into how a villain is made, but I don't necessarily think that that requires us to have a level of empathy for them, especially when they are not giving that same level of empathy to others. So yes, I'm excited to read this and see what I think of it and see what I think of the movie. So I will check back with you once I've dug into this. Okay, so it's been a few days and I am on chapter 18 of the book. I'm about halfway through. This is how much I've read. And to be honest, my thoughts so far, I'm kind of bored. I think there's something about visiting this story and this world in like the prequel context that makes it feel like there's less stakes, and especially because we are visiting it from President Snow's perspective, or Coriolanus's perspective. I've been listening to this on the audiobook and it's quite great. I do like the narrator. I don't like the way he does some of the female voices, but it's helping me get through the book. Although I know this is like a prequel and I know that we are taking Coriolanus's perspective, I feel like so far this is paling in comparison to the original Hunger Games trilogy. Visiting this, I'm like, there's such less stakes and I am like finding myself so bored by Coriolanus being in school and his petty concerns in comparison to like everything that we've gone through in Hunger Games. Obviously, we are approaching this from a perspective of knowing that he's gonna eventually become the bad guy and that he is kind of a bad guy. And I don't know necessarily that we're supposed to sympathize with him. I think we're not really supposed to. I think we're supposed to remember that, you know, he's gonna be an awful person. But I still don't understand the purpose of telling this story because I'm not gonna feel sorry for him, but it seems like the text wants me to feel bad for him or to understand how he became who he is. But then I think maybe it's supposed to be more of a like satire or of a, you know, commentary of like how he is and how the capital people are. So I just feel like it's this really weird place to be in with this book. It's not enjoyable, but it's also not very interesting, and I don't know how I feel about it. It's obviously super messed up the way that like the kids at the academy are like helping think of ideas to make the Hunger Games better, and just the way that Coriolanus is like so sort of crafty. He's talking about all of his personal concerns about how he's gonna lose his apartment and about how he's poor and how he doesn't have much and he doesn't have the clothes that he wants and that, you know, the Snow name used to mean something, and he's willing to do literally anything to serve his own ends and help himself. And I think we're supposed to understand that, like, he is an awful person. But again, like, I just don't see the point in hearing this story. I'm like, okay, I know he's an awful person. Like, what? Tell me more. Another thing I'm finding is that the Hunger Games that's happening in this book, the 10th one, where he's like being the mentor to Lucy, who is the tribute from District 12, I'm finding that like the stakes for that Hunger Games is just so low in comparison to the Hunger Games that we go through in the original trilogy and then in Catching Fire. And also just like the technology is so much more advanced than the original trilogy. And so we're seeing like an archaic old version of the Hunger Games, and I'm just finding it like kind of boring, to be honest, because there's none of the like shiny gimmicks that we get in the original trilogy. Although we are seeing how, you know, the sausage is getting made in this one, it's still not that interesting to me. Another thing I am just like so weirded out by is the little infatuation that Snow has with Lucy, but I do think there is something to be learned from that and like some commentary being made there. It's the way that he thinks he likes her and he's jealous of her having any sort of lover back in District 12, but he's also not super upset about letting her go into the Hunger Games, and he's always thinking about her as how she can help him and how she can further his own ends. So through that like weird little infatuation, we learn more about him. It's just like so weird. And I also personally don't really like Lucy as a character all that much, but I feel like there's more layers to her and I feel like she's going to surprise us later on in the book. She's definitely got some spunk to her. One thing I'm finding is that like the songs that are in the book, I'm intrigued to see how they're going to be performed in the movie, so I'm excited to see that. In terms of other characters, I really like Dr. Gall. She's so unhinged. Obviously she's an awful person, but like I love seeing how sociopathic and unhinged she is. One thing I'm not liking is just the amount of characters that are in this book. Between the Academy and the tributes, there's just so many characters to keep track of, and I personally don't really care about most of them. It is interesting to see how like the capital is taking casualties out of the Academy kids as well, which is something I didn't really expect, along with Coriolanus being like poor and all of that. Like I didn't expect that stuff, but I still think none of this is making me sympathize with any of them, which I don't know if that's the point or maybe it's not. I don't know. I feel like I need to get to the end of the book to really see what Suzanne Collins was trying to achieve with this book, because right now I just find it boring and unnecessary. Obviously this whole story is just making me think more about like what's going on right now in Palestine and just the juxtaposition of Israel, Tel Aviv, and then everything that's going on around that and all of the awful things that are happening in Gaza and in the West Bank, and how it very much mimics what's going on in the Hunger Games books. The capital in the middle, unmarked and happy and doing their thing, while they reap everything from the surrounding areas, from the districts. Obviously the story is very timely, but I'm just thinking again of all the people who have read the Hunger Games series, who have watched the movies, who even directed the movies and continue to support Israel and the idea of it and, you know, the Zionist project, and don't seem to understand the parallels between these two things. Like, people will talk about revolution and fighting back when it comes to fiction or when it comes to other white people, but they will not stand for it when it comes from a person of color, when it comes from someone who they think of as lesser than them. Even in the book, you know, Coriolanus is so fine with committing these atrocities to the district people because he thinks that they have done something bad to him. You know, they've taken his parents away from him. The rebels have bombed him. And in his mind, he thinks it's perfectly fine for him as someone from the capital to retaliate and, you know, take this vengeance. But he's not thinking about how this whole situation is brought by the capital and what they have done to begin with. Like, there's no reason for the oppressed to revolt and rebel and to fight back if they are not being oppressed in the first place. Anyways, reading this is just making me really angry and, you know, upset with the world, but I am interested to see what happens by the end. I put up an Instagram story asking you guys for topics you want me to discuss about the book, and I did peek at it briefly, and one of you did mention that there's a pacing change towards the last 30% of the book, so I'm excited for that. I feel like there's going to be a lot more that happens in this towards the end. The pacing of this is kind of reminding me of like Catching Fire, in the sense that Catching Fire was pretty slow for most of the book, and then once they get into the, you know, Hunger Games again, that's when it starts to pick up, and I feel like this is gonna follow a similar trajectory, like it's gonna pick up towards the end of the book. Anyways, that's about all I have to say about this. While I am reading this though, I have been reading some books to do with Palestine and by Palestinian authors. I've been reading The 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. This is such a fantastic nonfiction book. He really takes you through the history of Palestine from 1917 to 2017, and really just giving you all the information to understand what's going on in Palestine right now and the history of Zionism and how this situation even came to be. Another book I'm reading is Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Y. Davis. This is such a fantastic nonfiction as well, and I'm listening to the audiobook for this one, and it's narrated by Angela Davis, and she is expressing her opinions and, you know, arguments about these different topics and how our struggle for freedom is a global effort and needs to be thought of with intersectionality in mind and a global context in mind. So she talks about a lot of the connecting elements between what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Palestine, and what Israel is doing to what's going on in the United States, and with police brutality and militarization of the police and, you know, the prison industrial complex. Like, so many things are just so connected, and we need to think about all of these in a, you know, multifaceted way. So yeah, I hope that while you're watching this and while you're thinking about the Hunger Games series, you're also picking up other books about things that are real life happening in our world that are very much the picture of dystopia. Dystopia is not a fake thing. It's a thing that is literally happening in our world, in places that maybe you aren't firsthand experiencing, but it's happening. And, you know, just because this is a fiction novel doesn't mean that what's happening out there is fictional or something that you shouldn't care about. Okay, so I finally at last gotten to part 3 of the book, and guys, I don't know what's going on. This is turning out to be a little different than I expected. So I was like reading and I was like, there's so much more of the book to go, but it seems like the Hunger Games in the book is gonna end soon. And then we get to the end of part 2, and our dear Coriolanus is becoming a peacekeeper because he's been caught cheating. At least I think so. I haven't started part 3. I just finished part 2 and I was like, let me update you guys. So I'm intrigued. Obviously he's gonna be a peacekeeper, but I'm sensing that there's gonna be some sort of unrest in some of the districts that he is forced to peacekeep at. But I'm also curious to see how he gets back to a position of power, because as we know, he eventually becomes president. And so how does he save his house? How does he save his apartment and his life? Obviously I knew that Lucy would probably win the Hunger Games because like what else was gonna happen? And I'm not surprised by Coriolanus cheating in the Hunger Games, you know, with the poison and with the handkerchief and the snakes and all that. It's been interesting to be in his head because he's just so laissez-faire about torturing these people and letting them die. One thing that is like a running theme is that he keeps talking about Lucy as like a possession, like he wants to keep her. There's a part where he's realizing he might actually win and he's thinking about what's gonna happen later and he's like, and she'll be all mine, like I'll get to keep her, is what he literally says. And it's just so interesting how he views, you know, this girl that he supposedly really likes and potentially loves. So yeah, obviously he's super messed up, but I don't think he's quite reached his supervillain status. So I guess that's what we'll see happen in the last third of this book. Again, I'm still not feeling like this is gonna be an amazing read, but I feel like the last third could change the game for me. Right now, it's sitting at a solid 2.5 stars for me, maybe 3. We'll see, but I feel like the last third could bump it up to like a 4. But for sure, it's not gonna be a 5. Anyways, that's my update. I'm probably gonna try and finish this later tonight, so I will check back with you when I've done that. So I finally finished The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and I don't know how to feel. So before I tell you my rating, let me tell you my overall thoughts on the last third of this book. So this was the peacekeeper section of the book where the pacing kind of changes and where we are seeing Coriolanus in a new light. He's a peacekeeper. There's so many things to talk about and I like don't even know where to start. I feel like I have 3 or 4 major things to talk about. So one is Coriolanus's character growth or lack thereof. Another is Lucy Gray and the whole romance in that situation. Another is Sejanus, who is a very big part of this entire story, I feel like. And then the fourth is Dr. Gall and Dean Highbottom and the other members of the Capitol, because I want to talk a little bit about that. So let's start with Sejanus. I felt like I saw the whole Sejanus dying at the end thing coming because I feel like he was that innocent character that had to die to show how awful Coriolanus is, how awful Snow becomes. But I do feel like it didn't really hit me all that hard because Coriolanus has such a low stake in everything. Like, he doesn't actually care for Sejanus himself. He just cares about his wealth. He cares about using him. And so when Sejanus is killed, although I feel super bad for him, I'm not super surprised that Coriolanus betrayed him at the end. Like, I was not shocked when he records him with the Jabberjay and sends that off and essentially gets him killed. Same thing with Lucy Gray. I feel like her whole existence in the romance is pretty much the same thing as Sejanus and his existence and that relationship. All of Snow's close relationships in the book are all relationships that he is ultimately using. Snow doesn't actually care about them as people or their well-being. He only cares about how he can use them and also if he can own them. He is very possessive of both of them, especially Lucy. He is constantly bothered by any other romantic prospect that she has. But he also feels like if he can't have her, no one can, which I don't have to explain is super toxic. But again, he also is so willing to like cut her off and kill her at the end when she no longer serves a purpose. When she is the thing standing in his way between himself and his happiness, like she is gone immediately. The second he thinks that she suspects him at the end when they're running away and when he realizes that he no longer has to run away, he immediately switches. And it's just so fascinating to watch because you know who he becomes later on. And so this whole book, you're just kind of watching him. And I think what bothered me about this book, which brings me to my third point about Coriolanus's overall character growth or lack thereof, is that we don't get any sort of character development in this book. Like, he's not going in a downward character arc or in an upward character arc. He is just sort of staying the same. He starts out slightly sociopathic and he continues being sociopathic. He kills more people along the way, but essentially his values have not changed. He's learned a few things. He has embraced his sociopathic natures and his callousness and his iron-fisted nature, but he is not necessarily changing as a person. And I feel like this would have been a more compelling book if we had, I don't know, seen some dramatic descent into darkness, or if we had seen some interesting arc of him trying to get something that he wants. But I feel like everything in this book was just a series of convenient events happening to Coriolanus. Like, he conveniently gets Lucy Gray, and he conveniently cheats and gets away with it for the most part, and he conveniently gets sent on this summer vacation as a peacekeeper. And like, I was calling that from the second he was told that he's going to become a peacekeeper, because I was like, this doesn't add up. Like, there's something that's going to change here. Like, at no point did I think he was going to stay a peacekeeper. I knew that he had some other thing coming. And I guess this could be a commentary on how, like, villains and bad people often do get their way and often have things maybe easier than the heroes and the people that we want to root for. But I just feel like it doesn't make for a very compelling book or story. Which brings me to my last topic, which is like Dr. Gall and like Dean Highbottom and the whole idea of the Hunger Games. I find Dr. Gall like really interesting, and I loved her character, but I didn't really love the entire reasoning that is basically given in this book for how the Hunger Games came to be. Essentially, at the end of the book, it's sort of revealed that Dean Highbottom, he did come up with the idea for the Hunger Games for a class assignment, and that Coriolanus' father, Crassus, had like gotten him drunk and gotten more of the idea out of him and then submitted it to Dr. Gall as an assignment. And Dr. Gall kind of ran with it and named Dean Highbottom as like the creator of the games. But to me, it just seems suspect and strange that a whole government and like military operation in the capital would go along with just using a child's idea from an assignment to create a death match between children of the districts. Like, it just seems odd to me. I wanted something a little bit more like dramatic, like something more significant. And maybe this is a commentary on how it's so easy to be callous and play with people's lives, but I wanted something more like that scene in Mockingjay at the end of the book where the leftover victors are brought together and told to vote on whether they think the capital's children should be put in a Hunger Games to like teach them a lesson and to avoid a mass murder of the capital citizens. And that scene in Mockingjay is just so iconic to me because it's this council of people trying to decide the fate of these people and, you know, are just so casually like, yeah, let's repeat this violence. And there's even this moment, and I went back to like listen to the last few chapters of Mockingjay after finishing this book today. I went back and listened to it, and there's even this moment where Katniss is like, is this how we are deciding this? Is this how the people who created the Hunger Games decided this? Was there some people who were vehemently opposed to starting the Hunger Games, but were they just sort of silenced in the name of being vicious and punishing the districts? And I wanted to see that scene that she is envisioning, where this group of well-meaning people are unable to win against the rhetoric and the callous and awful nature of these other people. And I feel like in my head, like that mimics so much of what's like going on today. Like, even though there are thousands, millions of people around the world protesting and totally against this genocide and are trying to get the US government to stop it and, you know, call for a ceasefire and just stop funding genocide, and yet still we are continuing because a few select people in power have the control of what's happening and are choosing to be violent. And it's all just really fucking upsetting. So yeah, I feel like this book just didn't do it for me. I feel like if I had to rate this, it would probably be like a 2.5 stars. I can't even say it's a full 3 because I didn't really enjoy it for the most part. I didn't really like being in Coriolanus' head. I knew he was the villain, and I have read other books where we're in the head of the villain and I have enjoyed them more because there's more of an arc, but this one didn't really have anything. Everything just happened very conveniently for him. He just continued to be awful, and I didn't particularly like any of the other characters either. Like, I sensed the honor in Sejanus, but Lucy Gray didn't really do it for me. She was a very different character from Katniss. I didn't really love how sort of light and airy she seemed. I honestly just really love like Katniss as a character. She is such a prickly, down-to-earth person. Like, she just cares about protecting her family, and she is just so endearing in that way. And to me, Lucy Gray just didn't have that element to her. Aside from that, I also just think the pacing of this book was just like so off. This was just so long. It's like 500 pages, which is much longer than I think all 3 Hunger Games books, like the original trilogy, which is just kind of mind-blowing when you consider what's happening in this versus what's happening in those books. Like, so much happens in those books in such a short amount of pages, and it packs such a punch, whereas this book just sort of drags on and on and on. Another thing I really didn't like was the songs. I know songs are an element in like the original trilogy, but this one just had so many freaking songs, and I was just getting so tired of it at one point. Like, I just wanted to flip past them, and I know some of them had like themes to them, but it was just like really annoying in my opinion. I think it's just like one of my pet peeves, songs in books, because it just feels like not the medium for that type of content, if you know what I mean. I'm really curious to see what the movie is gonna do with this entire book, but also with the songs, and if they're gonna be set to music and if any of the lyrics are gonna change. I'm sensing that the person that they cast for Lucy Gray must be a good singer as well. But overall, I just feel like this book felt so petty and like small scale compared to everything that happens in the Hunger Games trilogy, and it just ultimately felt really unnecessary to me. Like, I could have lived without this book, without this story, and still would have been fine. Like, there is nothing in this that particularly stood out to me. Every message and theme that was of any importance was already dealt with in the original trilogy. Some of you did ask me on Instagram what I think happened to Lucy Gray. Honestly, I don't really care all that much what happened to her, but I do sense that either she died or some descendant of hers lived on, and that ended up being Katniss's family. I'm sensing that because there's like this history of the songs running through Katniss's family, and also that part where like Lucy Gray goes off to like pick up Katniss, and I feel like those were very targeted like Easter eggs, but maybe I'm just like grasping at straws, but if I had to guess, that's what I would guess. The last thing I'll say is that I'm interested to see how the movie is going to deal with just the overall tone of the book, and how most of the like content of the book and the important parts are really the monologues that happen in Coriolanus's head. Although there's things that happen, it's the way that he is so sociopathic in his head that I think really makes the book and like is the entire point of the book. And I'm interested to see how they're going to tackle that, because if you were just an external observer of him, you would believe that he's this great charming guy who's, you know, helping his friends, and it's only because we see the inner monologue in his head that we know he's an awful person. So I'm interested to see how that's going to be conveyed on the screen. Obviously they'll find a way, and I can imagine there's some solitary scenes where we'll see some of that, but it's also going to really come down to the actors acting, so I'm excited to see that. I sense that I will probably enjoy the movie more than the book, just because, yeah, the pacing and like just the way it dragged on was not it for me, and like the way that the songs appear in the book, I just did not like that. I feel like I will enjoy all those aspects more in a movie format. I feel like a book was just not it for this. Actually, on that point, I do feel like had this been just like a script that Suzanne Collins had developed for a movie only, I would have been fine with that. I didn't really need this book because it didn't really do anything for me. Okay, so I finally watched the movie. Let's discuss my thoughts. So the overwhelming feeling that I had coming out of the movie was twofold. One, that it was much better than the book. It just did so many things infinitely better than the book. And two, I think the reason for that is because this was actually written to be a movie. It wasn't written necessarily to be a book only. It was written because it was meant to become a movie at some point. I'll explain. So let me first talk about just the things I loved and the things that are different and all of that. So I think the major reason why I enjoyed the movie over the book is because a lot of the issues that I had with the book are solved by the medium of it being a movie. And this plays into why I think it was written to be a movie, not necessarily to only be a book. I quite literally believe that Suzanne Collins was contracted to write this book because they wanted another movie in the franchise, not necessarily because she just wanted to tell this story. So first up, the songs. I personally really didn't like the songs in the book. I think it's very hard to imagine songs and music in a book, at least for me, and I think it's common for other people as well, and the effect of the songs and the lyrics and the music just doesn't come through when you're reading it on the page. Especially these songs, because although like sometimes you can read songs as poetry and you can feel the effects of them when they're written, I think these songs in the book really need to be heard in order to feel the full gravity of them. Obviously, the actress who played Lucy Gray in the movie was absolutely fantastic. Her voice was freaking amazing, but also her performance was just incredible. She added so many layers to Lucy Gray's character for me, and the way that she sang the songs really did it for me. While reading the book, the songs just didn't have that much significance in my mind, although we could see like some of the lyrics that, you know, are pointing to things, and Coriolanus is like analyzing the lyrics in the book. Although we get that, you still don't feel the emotion of these songs the way you do when you are hearing them in the movie. And I was just thinking about how there's so many songs in this book, and part of that is because obviously Lucy Gray is a singer, she's a musician, but I also was just thinking about the fact that although there are songs in the original trilogy, there are not as many as there are in this book. And I think Suzanne Collins and the publisher and the editor really went ahead with these songs and this many of them because they knew it would translate really well in a movie context. The song performances really made the movie for me, and even just the music in the movie overall, generally, like a lot of the background music was fantastic, and I think that added to the overall experience. The second thing I really loved about the movie that I really did not like about the book was the way that we are not in Coriolanus's head when we're watching the movie. Obviously, you can't really be in a person's head when you're in the movie. It's really hard to communicate that in a visual sense, but we do get it in some parts of the movie. But I think part of why this book didn't have the effect that the movie had on me is because in the book we're getting it from Coriolanus's perspective. So a lot of the way he thinks of the characters and the way that he sees the world colors your perception of what's going on. And I think that's part of why I didn't really like Lucy Gray all that much. I didn't find her to be all that strong of a character. But when we see her in a more objective perspective in the movie, it is easier to empathize with her and sympathize with her and believe her to be a much stronger character. Again, the depth of the songs and the way that she sings them adds to that layer of her character, and also like the actress's performance of her character, and that's just something that we can't really get from the book. I feel like this is a story full of very subtle messages, and I think a lot of that gets lost in the book. But I don't know, maybe I'm just not that smart and it was very clear, but personally, I didn't feel that it was, and I did go back and look at some parts of the book again to compare it with what I remembered in the movie, and I just really felt like a lot of the scenes were much stronger in the movie. There are several parts in the movie where a lot of the thoughts that happen in Coriolanus's head are actually voiced by other characters instead. Most obvious is the confrontation between Lucy Gray and Coriolanus at the end, where she is like, you know, very aggressively asking him who the third person he killed is, and her reaction when he finds the guns, and how she herself voices that, you know, she's the only thing standing in his way from his freedom. And all of that just added to, you know, the dramatic tension, and obviously it needed to be voiced by someone else because we can't, you know, be hearing Coriolanus's thoughts. But I do feel like, just generally, I had more sympathy for all of the other characters. I liked all the characters more because I wasn't in Coriolanus's head. I also found Coriolanus himself to be a lot more interesting in the movie rather than in the book. Because we don't know exactly what he's thinking in the movie, it made for a more thrilling and interesting story, in my opinion. I definitely think part of the message of the book and of the movie is to humanize Snow, to show you that he is human and that he can still be a villain, he can still be this awful person, cold and calculating, that being those things is not mutually exclusive of being human. And to show you that, you know, humans do awful things. They can be villains. It's similar to the argument that's often made in rape cases, where the defense always tries to humanize the rapist and say that, you know, he's this tortured boy and he, you know, has gone through all this stuff. Similar with school shooters, you know, they try to humanize the person who does it, but just because they're human doesn't mean that they can't do these awful things. Good people still do bad things. Humans still do bad things. The image of Snow with the rifle gun at the end after, you know, shooting and machine gunning to hit Lucy Gray, and him just standing there in the wood with that gun. And it was just giving me incel school shooter vibe, tortured white boy who, you know, has mental health issues, who becomes a shooter or rapist vibes. These are human people who do awful, evil things. And I think that this book and this story did a good job of portraying that image. And this sort of relates to another message of the book, which is really summed up in the way that Lucy Gray says this at the end in both the book and the movie. She says, "I think there's a natural goodness built into human beings. You know when you've stepped across the line into evil, and it's your life's challenge to try and stay on the right side of that line." I think that quote is really great, and I think it's more powerful in the movie because you kind of just slide right over it in the book, personally, in my opinion. But the way that Rachel Zegler delivers that line in the movie is fantastic, and it really ties back into the conversation that Snow has with Dr. Gall at the end of the book and the movie about, you know, what the Hunger Games are for. I do think that scene was done much better in the movie just because of the way that the dialogue was phrased. So they both have similar, you know, points, but I think the movie just made it a little bit more clear. And basically Dr. Gall is like asking Snow, you know, what is the meaning of the Hunger Games now that you've, you know, gone through all of this? And in the book, he's like, it's an eternal war. It's a reminder of what we did and what we have the potential to do and of who we are. And she's like, okay, what are we? And he says, we are creatures who need the capital to survive. But in the movie, he says something a bit different, and it's along the lines of what Lucy Gray says, but rather than advocating in the affirmative for the goodness of humanity, he's actually advocating for the, you know, natural evil and chaos of humanity. That, just like how Dr. Gall was saying when she was stitching up his back in the movie, that we all kind of descend into chaos, that we are all able to commit horrible acts of violence if we are put in the position to. She particularly points out to Snow that he was able to like brutally beat Bobbin to death in the Hunger Games when he was put in the position, even though he has all of this like good breeding and manners and all of this stuff that should make him above this kind of action. And so now looking at both the book and the movie, I think the movie actually made me appreciate the story and the message of the book a lot more because it was done in a medium that was much more effective, in my opinion. The third thing that I absolutely loved about the movie, aside from the songs and not being in Coriolanus' head, is the fact that it just simply condensed the story to a much finer point and cut out the unnecessary dragging parts of the book. I quite literally think that the editor just gave Suzanne Collins like free rein and didn't really get her to kill her darlings because this book was just way too long. It was like at least 200 pages too long. There is so much time spent in the Hunger Games and, you know, in the Peacekeeper section. All of that I think could have been condensed, and the movie does a really great job of condensing all of those parts and giving you those montages through some of the longer dragging parts and getting to the heart of the story. I think because the book had all of this extra fluff, the central message of the book was less effective, in my opinion at least. But yeah, aside from that, aside from like the really great pacing in the movie, the wonderful music and songs, I just really loved the performances by many of the actors. Viola Davis did a really great job as Dr. Gall, and I absolutely loved Peter Dinklage as Dean Highbottom. I do think that Peter Dinklage's performance in the movie really added a human element to Dean Highbottom that I think was lacking in the book. I honestly didn't care too much for Dean Highbottom. We do get the sense that he's like an addict morphling and that he's sort of crushed by the fact that he's the one who came up with the idea of the Hunger Games, but I think it's just more obvious and more clear in the movie with Peter Dinklage's performance. And I just really love that scene where Coriolanus and Dean Highbottom are talking at the end, and, you know, Coriolanus poisons him, but the way that Peter Dinklage like performed that scene was just so fantastic, and he really portrayed the types of people who can give into that base, you know, villainous and evil instinct, but then regret those actions and then can no longer live with the guilt. I found him to be such an interesting character, but I just really found him more interesting in the movie. I really didn't care for him in the book. All of this said, I think generally I really enjoyed the movie, but if I had to rate the book, it would still be, I think, a 3 stars. I bumped it up an extra half star from 2.5 to 3 after having watched the movie because I do appreciate a lot more of the story and of the book. I went over some of the parts that I feel like didn't really hit me the first time, and then they hit me this time. So that's my overall feeling, but I do have a final thought, and it's that this book is so interesting. The story, the overall series is so interesting because it is calling out this idea of the baseness of violence, the nature of humanity, but it's also got so many parallels to our real world. But funnily enough, and actually very sadly enough, the concepts and the messages that are made in this book are not really translated to people in the real world. The director of the movies, Francis Lawrence, actually signed the letter in support of Israel after October 7th. And it's just very interesting that a man who was directing this movie about this awful regime that was abusing its power over the civilians in its country is then turning around and supporting one such regime. I will say it again, but YA dystopia is quite literally just all the bad things that are happening to POC in real life instead happening to white women in the books. And it garners such empathy and sympathy in these novels, but then we can't seem to replicate that empathy and sympathy in real life. And I think that is the real sad reality of all of this. It reminds me so much of this image of the Capital citizens and Capital Academy students watching Lucy Gray on the screen and crying and feeling all of this sadness and sympathy and chanting to get her out, but then still turning around and letting all of this awfulness happen to the districts, still being complicit in their oppression and still being happy to watch them die on screen as long as they perform for them. Anyways, those are my final thoughts on this book, on this movie. I think this whole experience just made me think a lot, and I hope that you guys have thought a lot along the way as well with me while you've been reading these books, watching this movie. I hope that you will not only read fiction, but that you will also engage with it and also see the parallels within our real world and see how we are much like the people in these books that are just complicit in oppression and that we do have the power to change things. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, let me know your thoughts on The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and on the movie and any of my hot takes on either. I would love to hear your opinions and discuss with you down below. As always, you can find my Instagram, Goodreads, TikTok, and Bindery down below, and I will see you guys in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!